It is a great pleasure and honor to introduce Professor Shah Mahmoud Hanifi. Dr. Hanifi is a professor of history at James Madison University in Harrisburg, Virginia, and the founding coordinator of the Middle Eastern Communities and Migrations minor at James Madison University. He is author of the books Connecting Histories in Afghanistan and Mount Stuart Elphinstone, I hope I pronounced it correctly, in South Asia. Hopefully you have some time to talk about this gentleman and his character in South Asia. He's also author of many book chapters, journal articles, and short essays. Dr. Hanifi, the floor is yours, and greatly appreciate your acceptance.
Well, thank you so much, Mehdi, for that really kind introduction. And it's a real special pleasure to join you graduate students at Duke, graduate student community, Iranian community in North Carolina. I think of Duke for many reasons, but most importantly, that there's a very significant historical presence of Afghanistan at Duke University, really personified by Louis Dupree, whose scholarly work on Afghanistan is very important. And he was based in some capacity for certain years at Duke University, where some of his papers are. And I had the opportunity to look at some of his archival material when I visited a couple years ago. My intention here, really in a number of ways, is to address something that the film content raises, and that's sort of the place of Afghanistan in the Persian cultural world, and the role of education and art in empire are real immediate connections to the preceding presentation that I really appreciated. So in broad measure, I'm trying to look at what empires do to Afghanistan and what Afghanistan does to empires. And the important thing to recognize is that empires look and behave differently through time. Empires do a lot of things on the economic, political, cultural, military front, all of which combine to make imperial power what it is. And of course, empires are about a number of things, including violence, but also including information circulation. And empires create new regimes of mobility and circulation of ideas and peoples and resources. And I'm trying to kind of explore with you here where Afghanistan fits into those imperial circulations. And the problem in taking a long historical view, which I'm going to try to do in a very short amount of time with you, involves the problem of Afghanistan being an entity, a geographic space, a territory that we identify on the map in a way that is sort of visible with this boundaries. I don't know if you can see my cursor circling, but these boundaries, it's very important to appreciate, are very new historically. Late 19th century, they appear. And so to understand the deeper history of empires in Afghanistan, it's very important that we kind of drop the boundaries and start thinking about the space and what moves to and through and from and within it in a way that's not constrained by the territorial nation state. So empires also are associated with other kind of tricky concepts. That's civilization and culture. And perhaps we can say in the same logical space, the Persian Empire, the Persian civilization, Persian culture. And the importance here is that you know, words and concepts do matter. And I think I'm taking an open-ended view of both empires and Afghanistan and looking at the relationship. Okay? So then, I am a teacher that has unfortunately become probably addicted to PowerPoint. So I have way more images than I think we kind of need. And for that reason, and given time constraints, I might be scrolling faster than you can see something that interests you. And please flag Mehdi or me in the chat, and we can certainly come back to anything you see that doesn't get addressed. All right. In the context of the introduction, I tried to insert some photographs into my discussion, thinking about photography as an imperial technology that worked on Afghanistan in kind of ways worth considering, perhaps. That's an insertion on my end, hasty. So here's a view of the Eastern Hemisphere that we can place Afghanistan and Iran and the Persianate world, perhaps in our own minds, on this empty map. But historically, I'd like to move through a number of imperial formations, is perhaps the way to say this, prior to the 20th century, when Afghanistan becomes sort of independent and formal, you know, empires kind of dissipate. The imperial era sort of in some ways ends. And we get, of course, post-colonial and neo-imperial expressions in the second half of the 20th century that we'll get to with American involvement in Afghanistan. But I'd like to kind of speedily look at some of the circulation patterns, the mobility of humans and resources and ideas and languages and religions through these periods, okay? And the first thing to recognize is that in ancient history, there are three, often sometimes fourth in China, but ancient river-based civilizations in the Indus Valley, in Mesopotamia, and in the Nile. And these civilizations may not be empires, but there are certainly kind of empires within these civilizations in the sense that we can talk about particular dynasties and their imperial characteristics in certainly Mesopotamia and Egypt. But the point here is that Afghanistan sits in between circulations between these empires, these civilizations, I should say. And in a very important way, resources from Afghanistan. This is a lapis lazuli mine in Badakhshan. And lapis lazuli from Afghanistan has circulated around the world through imperial connections and other sort of depoliticized commercial networks for millennia. And it ends up in the pharaohs with Queen Cleopatra. And this is one resource in the geographic space of Afghanistan that helps connect it to other cultural formations. Timber from the Himalayan mountains, including the Hindu Kush in Afghanistan, has also circulated around the world and continues to find its way to places like Dubai for architectural, imperial, state architectural purposes. And it's important to recognize that these commodity flows are very important for understanding Afghanistan's place in the world. And in a number of ways, Afghanistan is involved in two sort of commercial circuits, overland and through the Indian Ocean, kind of ancient coastal trade. So this wood that's being taken down a mountain would eventually find its way to roughly where Karachi is today, loaded onto a boat, and then kind of a coastal jumping to the Persian Gulf for Mesopotamian palace architecture. All of this involves Afghan resources, so to speak. It's important to note that the Persian civilization carries a lot of deep history and technologies that have been appropriated by empires and have affected Afghanistan. I'd like to continue to focus on natural resources through water here and the ancient Persian underground water channel technology known as Qanat, Qarez, and by other terms all around the world. This technology from the Iranian plateau has made its way to China and South America and Europe under different vocabulary. But it's so important to highlight the kind of structural relationship between Afghanistan and the Persian world. And both the Persian Empire and the space of Afghanistan get imperially connected through Alexander the Great's presence in the region. And of course, Alexander the Great is a city destroyer. Persepolis is burned, but there's also urban formations that take shape in Afghanistan, particularly in North Afghanistan, all right? And when we think of Afghanistan historically, without its borders, the geographic space itself can be defined with the Indus River being a sort of southern perimeter, the Amu Darya or Oxus River in the north being a sort of northern boundary, and the Hindu Kush spine of mountains really being the defining feature. And it's those waters and mountains that have attracted empires for millennia. Now, Alexander's presence generates an artistic sort of flow and set of connections between South Asia, the Eastern Mediterranean, and aesthetic traditions in between. And we see some very interesting sort of sculptural residue from this post-Alexandrian period that involves Afghanistan directly, in the sense that excavations from Afghanistan have yielded this material. And we get kind of, we must consider the relationship between empires and culture, and often this general period beginning about the year 0 to about the year 800 or 900 is often associated with Gandharan culture. Gandhara being a kind of cultural, less than a political, more than a political formation involving Afghanistan directly. The empires that took shape after Alexander, the Hellenistic states in the West and the Mauryan Empire in South Asia, basically communicated with each other about Afghanistan. And there's a treaty that sends elephants to the Seleucids, Mauryan elephants, for basically the space of Afghanistan, including Kabul and Kandahar, sort of traded for elephants between empires. A fascinating example of Afghanistan's dialogic relationship with multiple empires. And this is a very important feature of this space, that it's not just single empires, but multiple empires are present and compete within it historically. In the context of Gandhara, Buddhism becomes its own sort of civilizational impact. And of course, in central Afghanistan, the Bamiyan Buddhas are the biggest architectural residue of that period. I'm trying to move quickly to the Islamic period. If I might locate this period historically between about 1000 and 1500 AD for the moment. And in terms of, we can think of an Islamic empire or an Islamic civilization, but of course there are sort of smaller empires and cultural formations within Islamic civilization. And I'd like to sort of break this down roughly with the Ghaznavid Empire in about the year 1000 in Eastern Afghanistan, so central for the Persian language. Basically, Ferdowsi and the Shahnameh take shape under the patronage of the Ghaznavids in Afghanistan. It's absolutely critical. About the year 1100 rather, the Ghorid dynasty that replaces the Ghaznavid dynasty, based in the sort of Western Hindu Kush, roughly Herat, but more east than that, leaves a very important structural residue here, the minaret of Jam, that's now under great threat. But the Ghorids are also responsible for sort of transferring Iranian architectural traditions, of which this minaret is one, to Delhi. And so by about 1200, we can start to think of the Mongol Empire coming into play. And the Mongol Empire left a trail of destruction to the cities and agricultural zones and khanats and irrigation networks in the space of Afghanistan. If we think of the year 1300, we must think of the Delhi Sultanate in Delhi, India, that is important for us as a sort of the beginning of Islamic empires in South Asia, of which there are populations from the space of Afghanistan involved in these dynastic processes in North India. The Ghaznavids opened up South Asia to a corridor of communication with the Muslim world that brought the Persian language, Persians, Iranians, and Turkic communities to North India. It's so important. The Delhi Sultanate kind of captures that for us. In about 1400, we can think of the Timurid Empire in the space of Afghanistan, particularly Sultan Hussein Bekhara in Mazar-e-Sharif, the north of Afghanistan. The Great Blue Mosque of Mazar is an architectural sort of tribute to that period. In Herat, the wonderful fluorescence of miniature painting under the patronage of the Timurid Empire in Behzad, Persian miniature painting and sort of the fluorescence of the arts under the Timurids in Herat is an imperial cultural expression of Persian in such valuable ways for us. 1500 initiates, for our purposes, the Mughal Empire. And Babur is born in Fergana, north of Afghanistan, but he really makes his name and hones himself as a military and political leader in and around Kabul. He spent about 20 years in and around Kabul, and we have a wonderful narrative of his presence there. Babur goes on to found the Mughal Empire. At about the same time, the Safavis in Iran are sort of taking shape as an empire. And Afghanistan becomes a space of communication and competition between these two empires, drawing attention really to the different, shall we say, networks that Kabul is associated with in relation to Kandahar. The Mughals and Safavids were kind of competing over Kabul and Kandahar in ways that are worth thinking about for how empires reconfigure relations between market and urban locations, all with new sort of imperial geographies, new capital cities, peripheries. Empires kind of have a lifespan. They expand and maybe fragment or contract, and Afghanistan is a big part of those kind of historical ebbs and flows of empire. In all of this, there's a very substantive Islamic mapping tradition that takes shape, and I'll backtrack here very quickly. The Islamic Atlas tradition of kind of geographic and historical intellectual production is so important for the incorporation of the space of Afghanistan in an Islamic sort of epistemology and intellectual tradition that is worth considering through cartography and mapping. And the map of Afghanistan is an imperial product that we need to take seriously in the modern era. But before we do that, we must look at kind of early modern European imperial projections. And I'm speaking of sort of the Portuguese and the Dutch trying to create global empires that end up sort of on the fringes of Afghanistan and India in particular, and Southeast Asia for the Dutch, of course, Indonesia. But the point is that mapping the space between the imperial metropole and the colony of the empire involves Afghanistan. And it's so interesting to see how Europeans mapped this space from their kind of emerging imperial perspectives. And we can see here the inversion of Kabul and Kandahar and kind of making sense of the space from the imperial perspective. And maps are so interesting as intellectual artifacts and artistic artifacts and political artifacts. And Afghanistan's place in cartographic traditions is where I'm going here. And we can see early modern European maps from the 16th and 17th century, kind of mapping the space also involving Iran, Persia historically, and Afghanistan is kind of on the margins of maps, early modern European maps of Persia and India. And it's just so interesting, these maps. I've been spending some time with them recently, but they give us a lot of marginal visuality that has a lot of cultural detail to it. And I would like to draw attention through a 17th century map from a Flemish cartographer named Blau here, where we have basically the Persian Safawi Empire, Sofodi, you can see sort of the Latin in the left-hand corner, but there's only a dash of red here, a dash of red on a piece of clothing, a headgear, red head, Kizil Bash. And this really is a visual reflection of the imperial knowledge of the cultural landscape of Safavid Iran as a Turco-Persian hybrid sort of Shia, emergent Shia polity. And this is just such an interesting point that the Qizilbash sort of get, I am arguing through this, sort of located in the cultural processes and political processes of this space. This is so relevant because, I will come back to this, because the end of the Safavid Empire involves Afghans in a way that's catastrophic for Isfahan and for the documentary sort of the archive of this of the Safavids that was lost through the burning of the library and the city in the Afghan occupation of Persia in 1722. Okay, Nadir Shah Afshar emerges out of that transition from the Safavids through the Afghan imperial interregnum, as it were, to eventually the Afsharids and Nadir Shah Afshar, and then the Qajars. Okay, but Nadir Shah is a mobile empire. Empires have mobility about them in the pre-modern space. Nadir Shah might be the world's last great nomadic conqueror. And he's so important for Afghanistan for transporting Qizilbash communities to Kabul, Kandahar, and spaces in between and surrounding them. The presence of the Qizilbash in the space of Afghanistan is tied to Nadir Shah and has such a consequential impact on the content and structure of the Afghan polity that emerges with the death of Nadir Shah in 1747, the Afghan empire itself under the Ahmad Shah Abdali, who changes his name to Durrani when he's coronated, and that's the image up here that's in the right-hand corner. Those of you that were paying attention in August 15th, when Ashraf Ghani gave his last stand address and then the Taliban appeared at the desk a few hours later. The picture behind Ghani and the Taliban is an elaboration of this picture. The foundation of the Afghan empire in Kandahar by Ahmad Shah Durrani, who is crowned by the Sufi Sabir Shah. The point is, we have a lot of religious complexity, imperial kind of politics of Shiism, sort of a fifth school of Sunni Islam, Jafari Islam. It's such an important moment for Afghanistan, the birth of the Afghan empire with Ahmad Shah Durrani, with Kandahar as its capital, but continuing to invade the Mughal sort of carcass that's all decaying politically. And it's with the death of Ahmad Shah that his son moves the capital to Kabul. That relationship between Kabul and Kandahar is so important to think through. In jumping to the present, it's often said that the Taliban are from Kandahar, or Kandahar is their spiritual homeland. But conquering Kabul is a very different sort of cultural project, so to speak. And we can, of course, come back to that. I do want to position the space of Afghanistan and the role of language in empires. It's absolutely critical to appreciate the Persian language as a vessel of Persian civilization and Persian imperial projections. And similarly with Sanskrit from the Indian sort of background. And the Pashto language emerges in a sort of, in some ways, a sea of languages. And it's so important to sort of think of the dependency of empires on modern empires, on translators, for example. The role of language in empire is sort of where I would like to sort of a conceptual point of emphasis for the moment. Okay. And again, sort of positioning Pashto speakers within this Persianate world and the relationship between Persian and Pashto and those who speak those languages and their ethno-nomenclature is such a interesting and complex linguistic and political set of questions to consider over the long term. When the British get involved in South Asia and ultimately in Afghanistan in ways that are most often reduced to warfare, and empires are about wars, there is no doubt. The new technologies of warfare that empires bring, maybe today the drone is a very important example of war and empire and Afghanistan in that relationship. But the British did not, they didn't begin as a sort of a warring empire. They began as a trading empire. A trading empire, it's the British East India Company in India that had to get to know India through its languages. And it's the study of Indian languages, including Persian, which was the Mughal language of state. The early British officials in India had to learn Persian to get at other Indian languages. And the early British colonial officials are called Persianists, sort of Orientalists in the sense of language students of Persian. And what's so important here, again, the study of languages in empires, the education surrounding languages in empires. And this is positioning Pashto in a genealogy, essentially, that tracks those speakers through Chaldaic and Aramaic to the lost tribes of Israel. And next thing you know, it's the discipline of philology that's taking shape here in early colonial linguistics. That is, again, an imperial linguistic science that opens up all kinds of historical and geographic questions about the relationships between the languages, Persian, Greek, and Sanskrit. And this is the birth of the understanding of Indo-European languages. And the whole sort of global map of languages takes shape here. It's so important, again, I'm focusing on Pashto here for the moment, to highlight that Pashto and Pashtuns are kind of a somehow distinguishing feature of the space of Afghanistan, but yet differentiated in some ways and related in other ways to the Afghans in that space, or those designated as Afghans. And it's a very complex relationship between those categories, those words, those languages that I'm trying to highlight in the context of language study by the British. Here is Elphinstone's map. The British also mapped new spaces in new ways with new technologies, trigonometry essentially. And this map is a product of that sort of trigonometrical survey of India. That's the birth of modern mapping as we know it. And Elphinstone's map, I've written about this. It's probably easier to refer you to my chapter in the Elphinstone book that I can, it's on maybe academia.edu, I think. If you can't get it, send me an email or Mehdi and we'll be sure you get it. But maps are an interesting kind of language, an interesting kind of visual and political language to position within British imperialism. And essentially, the British don't see Afghanistan at first. They see the kingdom of Kabul. And it's the relationship between Kabul, the kingdom of Kabul, that sort of becomes Afghanistan through two British wars. Let me say, the first British war of occupation in Kabul, specifically 1839 to 42, And that war ends disastrously for the British and begins the Orientalization, in the sense of stereotyping Afghanistan as a xenophobic, tribal, forever resisting empire space, which is an imperial figment, a sort of colonial imagination at work here, because historically, Afghanistan has been open to all empires in various ways. You know, Afghanistan sort of lives through empires more than is the graveyard of empires, which is an inappropriate metaphor that renders Afghans there living in a graveyard. And we certainly don't want to think that way. More maps related to Elphinstone's map, and it's the dialogue between maps and the process of mapping that gives rise to the map of Afghanistan. Finally, in 1893, it takes its final shape. But there are other imperial visuals, kind of early ethnography, that are worth considering as imperial products, artistic, scientific in terms of ethnography, and intellectual, the sort of visuality of empire here. And now new kinds of maps, new kinds of early architectural drawings and strategic drawings of rivers and things like that. There's a whole repertoire of imperial visuals that come together to make modernity what we understand it to be as a visual experience. The maps of the rivers in the north and the Oxus, the Russians are involved in. Afghanistan is a space of imperial competition between the British and the Russians, the British and the French, and ultimately multiple empires are kind of competing over the space of Afghanistan as we know it. The mapping of mountains as the transit zone between South Asia and Central Asia becomes an obsession. Mapping of languages in Afghanistan is a large ongoing project. I inserted this because of the wonderful reference to film, and this may not fit perfectly, but let me just do my best in the following way. Afghanistan is typically understood to have gained its independence in 1919. That's associated with a third war against the British in 1919. That brings the famous modernizing King Amanullah to the throne with his sort of modern proto-feminist wife Soraya, and the sort of deveiling of Soraya, and sort of a big marker of modernity for independent Afghanistan. The word independence is what I'd like to focus on, because it, first of all, implicitly entails a form of dependency on colonialism prior to independence. And in return for the boundary making of Afghanistan, the Afghan leaders, particularly Abdurrahman, got paid colonial subsidies. The Afghan rulers who made a border got their subsidy increased. And it's very important to start positioning those boundaries as not Afghan national boundaries as much as imperial bounding of Afghanistan. But when Afghanistan gains its independence, it gains its independence with that map. And it sort of has to push its history and cultural and political identity into that space. So what independence offered Afghan elites was an opportunity to sort of move beyond the British Empire alone as a patron to now the French, the Germans. In the beginning, ultimately, Japanese, Americans. So my point here is that independence opens up Afghanistan to sort of other kinds of imperial competitions, including the demise of the Ottoman Empire and what that entails in 1919, so to speak, for, and again, this is so important for the emergence of the Pahlavi dynasty in the 20th century, which is an imperial zone of competition in the Great Game. And so these Afghan elites with independence start adopting a lot of modern Western European paraphernalia, entertainment, clothes, and administrative structures, architectural patterns. The whole sort of quest for modernity through the outside world. This is such an important period because Afghan rulers are not looking within Afghanistan itself for cultural resources, as it were, to harness, but external resources. It's so critical that this ultimately lures in the Americans. And we have here, I'm sorry, this is the reason I actually did this, because this also begins the period of sending Afghan students abroad to Turkey and then on from Turkey to Europe. And girls' education is a sort of product of this. A lot of imperial circuitry around girls' education and military education in Kabul in particular. And it's now becoming increasingly about Kabul. It's now very much the case that the world is seeing Afghanistan through Kabul exclusively, which is sort of an imperial mirage, because Afghanistan is actually not about Kabul at all. It's about the rural zones surrounding Kabul and the relationship between Kabul and other cities and the rural zones in between. So I'm going to quickly move. I'm so sorry. This would be the first sort of what becomes known as the Loya Jirga in Afghanistan, where provincial elites get incorporated into the state and then have to wear the state's uniform. When you become a part of the state, you have to look and act like the state. And if that is sort of modernity in a sartorial way, Afghanistan gets exposed to it in that before and after picture just very quickly. 1924, Loya Jirga. And this is, again, the power of photography as an imperial technology. Speaking of empires, the German Empire got interested in mapping Afghanistan for deep Aryan roots, literally. The Germans sent expeditions to Afghanistan in the 1930s to look for the original sort of organic substances that they thought fed the Aryans, and they considered themselves Aryans. And that sort of is an imperial Germanic effect with strong residue in Afghanistan. Very quickly, we are left, I don't know with how much time. Can I take 10 minutes, do you think, Mehdi? 15 minutes?
Yes, please. Yes, please.
All right. So we've made it to sort of the American imperial presence here. This is the first. Before an embassy is opened, there are sort of pre-embassy diplomatic presences. In the case of the Americans in Afghanistan, it was a legation. The American legation to Afghanistan opens up in 1942, I believe. This is the first American head of the legation, sort of the proto-ambassador, Cornelius Van H. Engert. And that's his archive is at Georgetown University, and this is his passport. Van Engert begins the process of getting American resources into Afghan schools. American material resources, that means teachers, that means school books, but also cultural transfers. This is a baseball team at Habibia High School in Kabul in the 1940s. This is an imperial artifact in so many ways, if we appreciate the United States as an empire And I just want to say a quick word about this, because I do so for primarily comparative purposes. A lot of scholars debate whether the United States is a formal empire or not, or if it's an empire in denial, or what kind of empire is it. And the important thing I'd like to emphasize is it's very useful analytically to historically view American activities in Afghanistan through a lens of empire, however formal or informal. And this kind of growth of an American presence through education initially gets magnified into other areas. I'll come back to this map. Okay, gets amplified into other areas of development, industrial infrastructure development in Afghanistan. During the 1950s, 60s, and 70s, the Americans funded the Helmand Valley Project, which is a major sort of integrated set of hydroelectric dams, roads, canals for new agricultural settlements, and it attracted thousands of Americans and millions of American development dollars. In the context of the Cold War, when Afghanistan maintained technically an independence during the Cold War, but ended up getting international development aid from the Americans in the South, the Soviets in the North, the Germans were involved in forestry in the East, and it is a development bonanza that Afghanistan experiences. By some measurements, Afghanistan was the largest per capita recipient of development aid in the world during the Cold War. The Americans played a huge role in this, and I'd like to frame this as kind of neo-imperialism through development. And be clear, the United States did use development as a tool of foreign policy, as initiated by Harry Truman in 1949 with the Point 4 program that led to the International Cooperation Association, that is the ancestor of what is now USAID. So there's a lineage of development here, American development projects in Afghanistan here. And there's a huge infrastructure of science and knowledge and educational exchange. On the periphery of this infrastructure development, hundreds of Afghans were brought to the United States to study all kinds of subjects, including engineering, but also police administration and anthropology. And education becomes an imperial pathway for mobility. And it's so important to recognize that, like translation, knowledge can fail. The hydrologic knowledge, the sort of soil science behind this project was incomplete and not done properly, and ultimately led to the failure of these dams to bring the anticipated development for exporting cash crops like cotton. Because of soil salinity, this region became the primary zone of opium production in the 1980s and remains so today. The important thing to note is that it's the failure of American imperial kind of hydrologic science that led to the sort of opening of the soil and the space to opium. That again is a very kind of contested imperial commodity. I need to go back to the maps because the British intellectual production of Afghanistan through Mount Stuart Elphinstone and language students and cartographers and administrators, generates a view of tribal groups of Pashto speakers, often called Pathans in British India. And we get the beginning of the conflation, the confusing interchangeability of the word Pashtun, of the word Afghan, and the word Pathan. And the literature on Afghanistan it has a fault line around it through the interchangeability of those distinct terms. It's a very complex issue. But what it sort of leads to, the idea of ethnography emerges in late colonial periods and begins to get institutionalized in the 1940s, but particularly the 1950s. Ethnicity, as the United States looked out at the world, the global South, as it were, the developing world, where there was competition with the Soviets, the lens through which they saw these national and subnational communities was ethnicity. Ethnicity emerges out of a sort of colonial lineage of tribal populations. So there's sort of an evolution of tribal groups and tribal genealogies and tribal studies in colonialism to ethnic groups and ethnic studies, and indeed ethnic studies programs in American universities during the Cold War. And what is so significant now is that during that Cold War development period, our Duke associate, Louis Dupree, was the primary point person for American knowledge production about Afghanistan and Afghanistan. Louis Dupree wrote a big book, just like Mount Stuart Elphinstone, who was the first British ambassador to the Kingdom of Kabul that became Afghanistan. So kind of Elphinstone represents the core of colonial knowledge. Dupree represents the core of sort of post-colonial knowledge for the Americans. Louis Dupree deployed the idea of ethnicity to understanding Afghan politics, the economy of Afghanistan, and the politics and economy behind the Helmand Valley Project, and understanding the Afghan state. And this is very consequential. The appropriation of ethnicity in an American imperial context is so important for us for the following reason. Now, just like the Afghan elites in the 1920s sort of adopted European clothing, political, and entertainment forms and patterns, the Afghan state began to map itself. And the map that the Afghan state produced of itself is predicated on data gathered by the Helmand Valley Project, particularly the corporation, the Morrison-Knudsen Corporation, who subcontracted an aerial mapper, a company named the Fairchild Mapping Company. That was the first aerial map of Afghanistan. So the Helmand Valley Project generated aerial mapping of Afghanistan. The Third British War in 1919 brought the first aerial bombardment of Afghanistan. And what I'm trying to say is that it's air power and empire that have devastated Afghanistan in so many ways. Now, the map on the left is a map of Afghanistan produced by the Afghan state using the sort of data collected by the American corporations I just mentioned. The greatest threat to the integrity of Afghanistan and Pakistan was the idea of Pashtunistan, that is sort of playing on the Pashtun, Pashto language speaker politics of Pakistan. Remember, the British leave South Asia in 1947. The independent states of Pakistan and Republic of India and others in South Asia are the sort of geopolitical context that the Americans see the space of South Asia. And of course, the Soviet Union is the driving concern here. And of course, the American involvement in Iran over oil is a big part of these imperial views of Afghanistan. And the Americans latched onto Pakistan for military aid. And the point is that the Americans began to see Afghanistan in relation to Iran, Iranian oil, Mossadegh coup, for example, as well as the emergence of Pakistan and the stability of South Asia and the support of Pakistan. So the American is expressing itself differently in Iran, Afghanistan, and Pakistan for the moment. Let's just accept that empires express themselves differently in different locations. And Afghanistan has experienced that multiplicity of imperial projections. Here's more about the Helmand Valley. Okay, we talked about the opium. The Soviet Union invades in 1979 to sort of sustain a socialist revolution of 1978 that was fragmenting. I'd like to draw attention to the Soviet air war, the use of napalm, particularly in the eastern forested regions, particularly in Paktia, that the American development regime was trying to turn into a zone of tourism. And sort of the role of tourism and empire is a sort of separate concern. The irony of Afghan tourist organization, Passport to Peace, is what I'm trying to emphasize here in this way. The Soviet Union's part of its imperial protection, beyond napalming the forests of Paktia, also involves a lot of educational, linguistic, gendered activity, legal activity, artistic activity involving Afghanistan that I mentioned when I came to Duke. I believe Mehdi was in the audience then. I wanted to just remind him how fondly I remember that discussion of imperial visuality in Afghanistan. This is Louis Dupree. Louis Dupree is here posing with Afghan Mujahideen commanders. And I'd like now to talk about the American empire in its overt public diplomacy, development, expression, and empire as a system of covert violence. And by that, I mean the American imperial funding of the Afghan Mujahideen, who are the sort of set of ancestors for the Taliban in important ways. The Mujahideen and the Taliban have an imperial genealogy routed through the CIA and the ISI and funding streams, and a global jihad network that is fully resourced by the American imperial covert operations in this space during the Soviet invasion. This sets in motion a series of devastating consequences for the people of Afghanistan, where the concepts of ethnicity became hyper-militarized. And the kind of brutality that the Afghan Civil War, under the British, it's communal violence between Hindus and Muslims. Under the Afghan American war, it's ethnic warfare with groups unleashed upon one another in the most inhumane and vicious ways that leave a social and cultural residue that will take generations to work through. And it's the idea here of ethnicity that I'd like to highlight as the imperial way of understanding Afghanistan. And we have an ethnic map here, sort of colored in, but it's Dupree's map. It's based in languages, and you can see that. But upon 9/11, this map, and I'm saying September 2001, if you can see my cursor circling, ethnicity, that is Pashtun ethnicity, became militarized. It became a friend or foe thing. All the while, sort of with the imperial understanding that Afghanistan is a place dominated by Pashtuns, but yet threatened by Pashtuns, a state that's dominated by Pashtuns, but yet it's a failed state, it doesn't work. And so the imperial narrative discursive contradictions. How can a state that's dominant be a state that's also failed? You have to have one or the other as a sort of conceptual starting point to launch ethnicity as a causal explanatory variable. So we have a really big problem with ethnicity as an imperially militarized category of activity in Afghanistan. And you see the sort of way that this has been mapped very quickly. And we can come back to that. I want to say that in addition to overt and covert imperial expressions, overt and covert warfare in Afghanistan, for example, continually through the 20 years of just relentless monsoon rain of bombs on Afghanistan. Also involved humanitarian activity, international, a sort of global empire of humanitarian workers came in the context of the war that was in many ways a relentless bombing campaign. And the imperial contradictions I mentioned before about identity and political structures, also war and peace, destruction, humanitarianism. Empires do contradictory things at the same time as they express themselves differently in the same space of Afghanistan. Natural resource management in the context of the American war becomes important. We see the American empire kind of tracking timber in ways that perhaps Mesopotamian empires would hope to do millennia before. The relentless bombing of Afghanistan, from Tora Bora in 2001 to the mother of all bombs in 2019, has devastated the environment. And I just want to now emphasize the devastating impact of global war, not 20 years, but 40 years, on the environment of Afghanistan and social fabric. The groundwaters that the Qanat system sustained and sort of maximized for us have been polluted with depleted uranium. Through the depleted uranium the United States uses in its munitions. There are birth defects that have now become endemic in Eastern Afghanistan, in hospitals in Kandahar, because of the environmental consequences of imperial warfare. And this involves, empires involve data management. Empires involve propaganda and censorship. And sort of the discourse of Afghanistan involves tremendous amounts of propaganda and censorship at the same time. And we want to believe that the American soldiers in Afghanistan are playing games with children and soccer and feeding them and hugging them. And this is propaganda for a domestic public. The propaganda of the interpreters, the language-based context of the Afghan interpreters that will be arriving in North Carolina. I live in Charlottesville and Harrisonburg. They've come. They're here. 30 families in Harrisonburg in the last 2 weeks. Charlottesville ready to welcome more. Language and empire. And the point here now is that empires, that's a very tough relationship. The translators of empire, they understand empire, and they may not be happy with it. And empire is never happy with translation. The point is that in reality, the translators don't trust the commanders, and the commanders don't trust the translators. It's not a love fest between the Afghan translators and the imperial actors alone. There's some tension beneath that narrative that's worth reckoning with. This is the Taliban poster. I mentioned the desk and the image beforehand. And the sense now of the Americans needing to have a Pashtun in name ethnically ruling Kabul, that's Karzai, brought to power through American special forces on the left, and Ashraf Ghani, who was an American citizen, went to high school near Seattle. Both speak English fluently. That makes a difference. Good Pashtuns, so to speak, or Ghani became a pariah, I guess, when he fled. But these were Pashtuns who ruled the state and could be trusted. At the same time, the Taliban were the Pashtuns who could not be trusted. And what we have here is an imperial cultural sort of game of good Pashtuns versus bad Pashtuns and trying to manipulate. There's a very famous essay by Mahmoud Mamdani about good Muslim, bad Muslim after 9/11. That's worth a read if you are looking to contextualize the reference I'm making here in the context of the American global war on terror. I'm going to leave you with just the last slide. This is James Madison. I teach at James Madison University, and it's important. Often the Federalist paper has given rise to the Federalist Society and the sort of neoconservative legal implications of that. But James Madison had a view on sort of war, and I'm giving you the quote here for you to read. But perpetual war brings empires down. And we have that sort of danger, a warning of it earlier with Dwight Eisenhower in his kind of farewell address, giving us some information about the military-industrial complex to watch out for during the Cold War. In the background of those images are American military bases abroad, hundreds of them, known to the public and unknown, all leaking toxins into the environment, just like American bases in North Carolina leak toxins into the environment. And again, I'm trying to draw attention to war, imperial warfare, and the kind of environmental. Here's the last thing I'd like us to think about, this relationship between empire, education, and where we are now, and the role of Afghanistan in this complex relationship. This is a slide from a lecture I gave at JMU, Democracy in Peril. You can look at the lecture online.